I've shown you this image before. This is one of the castles of the daimyos. Daimyos were the clan lords, the heads of the various clan families throughout Japan. At one time there were over 200 different clan families, and so they were very large, and each of these daimyos, each of the clan lords would develop their own army, the samurai. And this military class, a martial class, grew up under the daimyos, and most especially was emphasized during the shogun periods, which began in the late 1100s. But we really, to see the beginning of this, we really go back into the 700s. In 794, the Japanese emperor moved the capital and court, as I talked about during the emperors and shoguns talk, moved the court from Nara, the city of Nara, to the city of Kyoto. This was known as the Heian period, because Heian was the name of Kyoto in ancient times. And the Heian period was a time probably of the greatest development of culture and Japanese aesthetic and art. As I mentioned, a lot of the things had come over from China to Korea and from Korea to Japan. And in the end of the 8th century and into the 9th century was when they really began to develop a uniquely Japanese approach to the various arts. And so there was a huge emphasis on that. And the emperor and his court got so involved in the arts and in the development of culture and unique kind of ethos of being Japanese rather than having adopted these from ideas from other countries, that they really stopped paying attention to the doing of business that was required for government. More and more during this period of time, the Heian period, the emperor and the court began to push responsibility for managing the country, really for controlling the country, out into the countryside, to the daimyos, to the clan lords who lived in castles like this. And it was during that period of time that the daimyos and their samurai retainers grew more and more. This, of course, these are two models, but this gives you an idea of what typically people think about when they speak of samurai. I should say, too, that daimyo, the word daimyo, the clan lords, means great lands. They were the great landowners. And during this period of time, as I mentioned the other day, as the daimyos took over more responsibility for controlling the countryside, they also were responsible for collecting the taxes. Taxes were due from all the land technically belonged to the emperor and the state. They parceled the land out, and everyone was responsible for paying taxes in rice or in other product, but usually rice, meaning they were responsible for delivering it to the capital city, by the way. That was the hardest part about paying your taxes. You actually had to deliver it. But they also had to do service, and they had to pay a head tax for the people that were working. Well, the exemptions from the tax were either lands that were owned or controlled or had on them a monastery or a shrine or a temple. And so the daimyos, very, very smart guys, they began to build more temples, Buddhist temples, and Shinto shrines on their own property, which meant that property, whatever they grew there, was exempt from tax. There also was a law that whoever would cultivate new land that had not been previously cultivated, in order, as the population grew, they needed more food grown. Whoever would take over new land and cultivate it, grow crops, would be exempt from taxes. At first it was for several years. Eventually it was forever if they took it over. And so the daimyos were taking over more and more land. That meant they were paying less taxes, gathering up more land that they didn't have to pay tax on, and they were the ones responsible for collecting the tax. So, of course, they took a share before they delivered it or allowed it to be delivered to the capital city. In this way, the daimyo and their various samurai became more and more powerful over the Heian period, which again began right at the end of the 8th century and beyond. Samurai literally were a minor military nobility. They were minor nobles, but they especially focused on the martial part of the arts. More than just martial, though, I'll talk about in a few minutes. Samurai literally means to wait upon or to accompany one. These were primarily seen as supporters. Their whole focus was to be supporters, protectors of, and the people who enforced the will of the daimyos and of the shogun later on. The Fujiwara clan, as I mentioned, for several hundred years really controlled the emperor and the throne, because they would provide, for several hundred years, would provide daughters from somewhere within their clan to the emperor to be their primary wife when the emperor as a young man would take over. And because of that, that meant that whichever new emperor was born from that union would consider themselves on the maternal side being part of the Fujiwara clan. And so the Fujiwara daimyo, the head of the Fujiwara family, ended up being the power behind the throne for a very, very long time. In the mid-12th century, two other powerful clans, the Taira and the Minamotos, got together and defeated the Fujiwaras and threw them out of power. They tried to make a comeback later and were not successful. And the idea was to let the emperor be in charge and not have power behind the throne. Well, the Taira immediately stepped in and did the same thing. They started providing daughters from the Taira clan to the emperor, and they started running things. Well, that led, after 20 years of the Taira being in charge, to another battle between the Minamotos and the Taira, and this was called the Jinpai War. The Jinpai War, which was the war between really all the samurai clans, but it was led by Minamoto on one side and the Taira family on the other, was widespread. All of these different crossed swords here are places where battles were held. The final battle in the Jinpai War, was Dan no Ura, excuse me. I think I'm allergic to sushi. No, I'm not, trust me. The Dan no Ura battle, which is reflected down here, was actually a naval battle. It was the final battle in which the Minamoto family defeated the Taira family, and the decisive victory was on April 25th of 1185. So here, toward the end of the 12th century, we have the beginning of the shogun period. The first shogun I talked about already. This is all leading up to more description. I know you've heard part of this before, but I have to say this again as a foundation for describing the samurai. Minamoto no Yoritomo was the first shogun. His forces, and he was a wily fellow, when he went into some of the major battles, he looked like he was way outnumbered, but he had behind the scenes made arrangements for people to leave the other side in mid-battle and join him. So he ended up, being the wily fellow that he was, winning this war, becoming the first shogun. He did not go to Kyoto like the other families had done in order to try to run things in the capital city. He went back to his home as you can see, this is called the Kamakura shogunate. Kamakura was his hometown. That was the center for his clan. And so he went back there and simply set up his own government. There was a parallel government. He had his own judicial system using the daimyos as judges. He set up his own military system. He set up his own administrative system. And so for until the late 1800s or mid 1800s, the shoguns, the military commanders, continued to run the country. In addition to him being the shogun, which is taken from a term which meant the commander-in-chief of expeditions against the barbarians. Shogun literally means the troop commander. Then he set up his own government called the Bakufu, which literally means the tent government, a military term, and he ran things. There were two other major dynasties of shoguns. The Ashikaga shogunate began in 1338, and it was centered in Muromachi, which is a suburb, if you will, of Kyoto. And then finally in 1600, the Tokugawa shogunate, which was the Edo period, and both the shogun and later the capital was moved to Tokyo, what we know as Tokyo, which was called Edo then. So the samurai, as I said, were warriors. They were bushi, to use the word that is common, was common then, the Japanese word. They talk about Bushido. Anytime you've got do on something, it means the way of. So Bushido was the way of the warriors. It's not a word that was used very much back in ancient times. In fact, until the 1800s, people writing about the previous periods of the samurai began to use the word Bushido fairly commonly, but it wasn't really that common back then. They were servants, military servants of the wealthy landowners, and they were the ones that made it possible for the daimyos and the shogun to eventually take over control from out in the countryside of Japan. The problem was that often the samurai armies of the different daimyos would fight each other. It's always been a case whenever you have a trained army that is trained to do battle, if they don't have someone to fight, they'll end up fighting each other almost invariably. And so this is something that had happened over many, many centuries, that they were fighting each other. When Minamoto, the new shogun, took over, he really focused and organized the samurai in a much more controlled way. And you also had, in addition to these samurai, which were the sort of the frontline soldiers, they were recognized as military. Someone asked me the question the first time I did this talk, and so I include this now. There also were ninjas. Ninjas were real things, only they didn't all wear black stuff, black clothing and sneak around all hunched over like you usually think of them. They were, in fact, whereas these samurai were the armies, they were the military, the frontline fighters. The ninja were the special agents. They were the spies. They were the assassins. And so they would look just like any other Japanese person. They didn't wear special outfit because the point was they were supposed to blend in. And it's kind of hard to do that when you're like this all the time. So I'm sure if they were fighting at night, then they would wear black clothing. But that's not something that was specific to them. But there were ninjas as well during this period that were the assassins and spies. Now the samurai. A lot of people think that all Japanese men were samurai. No, that's no more the case than that all adult men in any country belonged to the military. This was a uniquely martial or military class within society. It's estimated that about 10% or less of the Japanese population during the samurai period were actually part of the samurai. There were at about 1.3 million high samurai, and they were defined as those who were permitted to ride horses, and particularly to ride horses in a battle. And then there were about 500,000 low samurai. The low samurai were those who were samurai, but they were not horsemen. They were not to ride into battle, and so they were a slightly lesser class. Importantly, the samurai were more than just soldiers. They were more than just warriors. They were expected to be literate and highly cultured. The samurai were expected to blend together a harmony between martial or military learning and experience and a literary or learning kind of thing. In fact, there was an expression, the bunbu ryodo. Bunbu ryodo means the pen and the sword together or in accord. So the samurai were expected not only to be literate, to be able to read, but typically they would practice calligraphy. They were great advocates of the tea ceremony as a very cultured act of meditation. They would write poetry. They would play music. Most of them played musical instruments, and they were students. In fact, the samurai, being so highly literate and being such a powerful force during the shogunate periods, during the Edo period, 1600s to the mid-1800s, the literacy rate in Japan was higher than the literacy rate in Western Europe, because of the influence of these very cultured, very well-educated samurai. And so they were more than just fighters. They also were scholars in many ways. It's also true that while there were a lot of skirmishes and small battles between various of the samurai clans, there were battles, and this is an illustration of the battle, of one of the battles, and you can see there are arrows, there are swords, there are spears. I'm going to talk about weapons in a few minutes, but one of the importance of spears is particularly for the low samurai, those that were on foot. The only way you could really defend against somebody charging you on a horse was if you have a longer weapon than they do, and so spears were very important to them. But there were times when the samurai battles could involve 150 to 200,000 warriors. There were several battles that ranked up those numbers. I mean, that was unusual, but it was possible for them to have as many as 200,000 people in major battles.
Wow.
There had been, in the 700s, the Taiho Code had established a formal hierarchy in society. And here, this is a very old picture of a samurai, or someone in a samurai outfit. This is the social hierarchy that had existed. The emperor, obviously at the top, then the court nobility, then once a shogun was named, shogun, the daimyos or clan lords, then the samurai, peasants or farmers, craftsmen, and then at the bottom of the hierarchy were merchants. The Japanese during this time had very little sympathy for somebody who simply bought and sold stuff. If you didn't make something like grow food, or make something as a craftsman, or if you were not part of the major or minor nobility, then you were at the bottom of the ladder. Later on, after the Meiji Restoration, when they were trying to turn Japan into more of a manufacturing kind of country and really trying to change it from purely agrarian to a country that compete with the West, then merchants became much more valuable, and there was the growth of these giant commercial conglomerates. But the point was that during the times of the shogun, the emperor and the court nobility became simply figureheads. They were nominal, meaning in name only were they in charge. The one really in charge of the country was the shogun and the clan lords under the shogun, and then the samurai. That was the military class, and this group here, shogun, the daimyos, and the samurai, were the ones that were really running the country throughout almost this entire, for about 700 years. And the emperor and the court was simply a figurehead. The shogun allowed them to continue. In terms of weapons, the weapon of the samurai, of course, was the sword, and the long sword. We're talking about a total length of just over 40 inches, including the handle. So most of them, would have a 32 to 39-inch blade. The katana is the long sword of the samurai still today. A katana is the long sword in Japan. And the Japanese were probably the best sword makers in the world. The metallurgy, they found ways to blend. The problem you always have when you're making a weapon a thin weapon out of metal, is it has to be hard enough to be able to put a sharp edge on it, because the more brittle it is, the sharper the edge is going to be, but it has to be soft enough that it doesn't break if it bangs into another sword or into armor or something like that. Well, the Japanese were masters at this. They would blend various kinds of metals together in form that would, and if you look at a modern, an ancient or modern samurai sword that is really done in the traditional way, you can actually see the moire patterns in it, where the two metals, the different kinds of metals have been blended together and then hammered and folded and hammered and folded and hammered and folded. Making of these swords was a fine art. In fact, you may already have been to some museums where you're looking around at all these exhibitions of ceramics and of clothing and all these things, and you'll come to a case and there will be a blade, just the blade, not the handle, or in the tsuba, the divider, or any of the rest of that. It would just be the blade, because the making of these kinds of blades was a phenomenal art form. And there are certain families that were so good at it, they're still known. I mean, you can pay a king's ransom for one of the swords made by the really great Japanese sword makers in the past. So the katana, the long sword, was the primary weapon. But the samurai also carried a second sword. In fact, if you see images of samurai, you'll always see two swords in the sash. They would, the two swords are called the daisho. Daisho literally means large and small. And only the samurai were allowed to carry two swords. That was one of the marks of the samurai. Another mark was a particular hairdo. They had a top knot that only samurai could wear. But the two swords, depending upon what the purpose was, it might be a katana like this, and then a wakizashi, which is a somewhat shorter sword, or it might be a tanto, which is like a long knife, but still much shorter than the other blades. And so a full set would be all three of these. But a samurai would only carry two. If he was going into battle, it most likely would be a katana and wakizashi. But the tanto was often carried if he's not going into battle or something. And as one guide said to us one time, the long sword was to kill other people. The short sword was to kill yourself if the need came. Seppuku. The tanto, the short blade, the knife, is what was used to disembowel oneself in case you were dishonored or you were defeated in battle. You had in that way shamed your master, the lord that you served under, or whatever. So, but always the two swords, the two blades. That's daisho. There are a lot of other weapons that they also used. The most dangerous one, this fellow in the bottom has got a keyboard. That's the most dangerous. No, he's got an abacus. They would use long weapons, as I say, particularly if they were foot soldiers, although there are certain kinds of spears that would be used by, initially by even soldiers on horseback, and then, once they had expended that, so to speak, like left it in somebody, then they would take their sword out. But they also used bows, and the bows were very important. The yumi is the bow, and a Japanese yumi, a Japanese bow, is very different than any other kind of bow in the world in that they're asymmetrical. the handle is not in the middle. The handle is down low, and the reason is they were very long because the length gave them more power. But when you've got a bow that's six plus feet long, it's very hard to fire it from a horse if you're trying to hold it in the middle. So the handle would be 2/3 of the way down the bow, so it's not symmetrical. But the particular, and this too became an art, Kyudo, or the way of archery. Kyudo became a very fine art. We were actually in Fukuoka, and we happened, and we still don't know what the event was, but we were walking along in Ohori Park in Fukuoka, and there were 30 or 40 or 50 young people in school uniforms that apparently were practicing Kyoto, the archery, art of archery, and they had the long bows and the whole, and they were practicing their draw and the whole thing, and it was quite something to see all those bows together, and they were all dressed alike, of course. So the yumi, the asymmetrical bow, was very important. Various kinds of spears, the yari and naginata. After the 1540s, when the Portuguese had come to Japan, they brought firearms. At first it was matchlock weapons, and after from the 1550s on, there actually were more firearms for a period of time in Japan than there were in many of the Western countries, because the Japanese took to it very quickly. I mentioned the movie, it's several times been mentioned, it's on the TV right now, I think, in your cabins, The Last Samurai. The Last Samurai historically is quite accurate in many ways, but a couple of the ways it's not so accurate is it presents the Meiji Emperor as being sort of a weak teenager, which he wasn't, and secondly, the guys who were defending the honor of Japan refused to use firepower, refused to use guns, and I don't think that was historically accurate as well. They were willing to use firearms. That was considered part of what, they were willing to pick up whatever modern capabilities there were available. They used cannon, particularly on castles and ships, but not portable cannon. Various kinds of staff weapons, and also, as you can see here, this is called a yoroi. It is lamellar armor, and they would either take stiffened leather, thick leather, and lacquer it, and so you get these bright, the colors of red and various other things, because they would put lacquer on it, or they would use pieces of metal that were laminated over one another, and then they would lacquer them as well. Later on, they actually used plate armor, but you would usually lacquer it. And they continued to use this up until the 1870s. A full armor for a samurai soldier could weigh between 60 and 70 pounds. So imagine carrying all that around, riding a horse, fighting a battle with a spear or a sword. You had to be in pretty good shape, I should think. Particularly during this time also was when we got to see a lot of the integration of Shinto, the folk religion of Japan, with Buddhism. The samurai and the daimyos especially liked Zen Buddhism. They liked Confucianism because Confucianism emphasized loyalty to your lord or your master, that you recognize your place in society and you have a responsibility to fulfill it. That's why there was so much focus on, fighting for your master, your daimyo, and if you failed in that way, then you were dishonored and you were prepared to take your own life as the only way to regain your honor. And partly that's because seppuku, the idea of taking a knife and inserting it into your lower abdomen and then drawing it across, was extraordinarily painful. It took an enormous amount of will. It would take hours and hours to die. It was a very slow, very painful death. So the idea was, if you were dishonored, if you were still willing to do that, it showed a strength of character and a resolve that would wipe away any other dishonor you had. It was the very fact that it was so painful and so slow a death was what made it able, according to their beliefs, to take away any dishonor that you might have had against your lord. But at that time, Shinto and Confucianism sort of joined together with Zen Buddhism, and it gave them both the sense of loyalty and of responsibility to the master, the one over you in society, from Confucianism. But then Zen Buddhism gave them both the concentration that was needed in the martial arts, and then it gave them the ability to deal with the constant danger of being killed, violently, and of having to kill other people violently. The meditation of Zen Buddhism really gave them the kind of psychological support that they needed in order to be able to live that very difficult kind of life. In fact, when the Meiji Emperor comes along in the mid-1800s, the daimyos and the samurai had been so much into Buddhism that the emperor in the mid-1800s tried to get rid of Buddhism because it was so closely associated with the daimyo and the shogun and the samurai. These two images sort of give us a comparison. The one on the left is a Western European knight killing a dragon. The one on the right is a samurai warrior killing a dragon. There is a legitimate parallel to be drawn between chivalry in Western Europe, where the knights, the armored knights, had a code of conduct that was necessary. And in fact, the code of conduct had initially been instituted by both the rulers and the church, the Roman Catholic Church, in order to try to put some sort of boundaries, some controls on Western knights. Because there was a period of time after knighthood started coming along that, they were like frat boys with weapons. They would go out and, kill peasants and all sorts of things. And so they came up with rules of conduct to sort of control that. Initially in the 800s, Charlemagne instituted some rules of chivalry, and then it really developed in the 12th and 13th centuries. It's a moral system. It implied a religious commitment. The Holy Roman Empire was big, along with the Roman Catholic Church, in supporting this. The knights were expected to be pious, so knightly piety was important. That's why you get the search for the Holy Grail by the Knights of the Round Table and all of that, because there was a religious connotation to being a knight. There also was a very strong ethos, sort of a martial but also moral ethos. They were expected to have courtly manners, to show honor and nobility, to not hurt those that were weaker than them, be willing to be brave in doing battle against other knights and others who were strong, but if someone was weaker, you should protect them. The sort of damsel in distress. The job of a knight was to take care of people who were weaker. And so that was very much what the Western chivalry was about. On the east side of the world, when we get to Japan, there was the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. This really began in the 8th century, similar time period to when chivalry began in the West, but developed a great deal in the 13th to 16th century. And to the samurai, Bushido meant reckless courage, a willingness to, even if it seemed that death was obvious, you still have the courage to do what you believe is the right thing. Later on, during the Second World War, because the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy tried to reinstate the code of Bushido, which has been dead for quite a long time, as part of their military ethic, this is why the Japanese soldiers would sometimes engage in suicidal bonsai attack, this reckless courage to do what they think was the right thing to do, even if it meant almost certain death. There was an extreme devotion within the samurai to your lord first, but also to your family, very strong family devotion. There was, as I said, the cultivation of the intellect, that you had to be a cultured, literate person, to be an expert in martial arts. Again, if you saw the movie The Last Samurai, or if you haven't, I'd recommend it. They spent a lot of time practicing with wooden swords in order to develop that skill. And the main character, the Tom Cruise character, who's a Westerner who ends up fighting with the Last Samurai. By the way, the Last Samurai is not one person. It's not Tom Cruise, and it's not the other daimyo leader. Last Samurai is plural. It means all of them were really the last of the samurai, because that's when the samurai class ended. The samurai were to be indifferent to suffering or discomfort. They were to disregard material wealth. The samurai were never paid in money of any kind. They were given food, they were provided for, they often would be given houses. In fact, did anybody go to Chiran? Yeah, you went to see the samurai houses. They're not palaces, but they were nice homes that would be given to them by their lords, and then they have beautiful gardens in them, because that was part of remember the Zen meditation thing, that was an important part of the samurai, so they would develop these beautiful gardens. They had to show honor, honesty, compassion, generosity, and self-discipline. The one thing, though, it was considered dishonorable to be taken by an enemy in battle or to surrender to an enemy in battle. This was considered a complete loss of face, particularly if that meant you were defeated when you were fighting on behalf of your lord. So seppuku, as I said, the suicide by cutting of the bowels, harikiri is a word that they used to use a lot, not so much anymore, was a symbol that a person could regain a way they could regain their honor, because it involved it was so difficult to do. It meant they were strong and that they were worthy of honor after that. There's a lot of that has been written by samurai about Bushido, and they're full of quotes like one daimyo samurai said, "It is shameful for a man to die without having risked his life in battle." Their focus was martial, it was military. And so risking one's life in battle on behalf of a cause that your lord, particularly that fighting for your lord, was critically important. One list of the kind of virtues that samurai should have were righteousness, heroic courage, benevolence or compassion, respect, integrity, honor, duty, and loyalty. All of these were the kinds of things that were to be represented or embodied in the way of the warrior, Bushido. These images, and this is one of those enormous battles that you get the idea that was possible. This picture here is actually represents an actual event. This is General Akashi Gidayu. He's preparing to commit seppuku after writing his death poem. I told you that samurai were supposed to be poets, and so it was typical before they would commit suicide, seppuku, they would write a poem. And then you'll notice he's got a tanto in his hand. He is preparing to commit suicide for having lost a battle in the name of his lord. This idea that they were willing to go into battle even if it meant certain death, and that's reflected in that movie, The Last Samurai, as well, and that they were willing to take their own life when they felt that honor had been lost, led Francis Xavier, St. Francis Xavier, who was the Catholic missionary who came to Japan in the 1500s. He once said, "There is no nation in the world that fears death less than the Japanese." So this was part of their culture. Eventually the samurai did decline, because even though it was two daimyos who began the movement, the Satsuma families and Chosen families, who gathered other of the daimyos and their samurai warriors to do battle against the last of the Tokugawa shoguns, defeated the Tokugawa shogunate army, and then re-established the emperor, the Meiji Restoration as it's called, because he was restored to power and the shogun was cast down. Even though they did that in the name of the emperor, fairly shortly after that, this was in the 1866 to 1868, in 1873, the Meiji emperor abolished the feudal system, which means he abolished the whole class of samurai. The samurai no longer existed. They could not wear the daisho, the two swords. They could not wear the headdress, the particular haircut, the samurai top knot. Particularly, they could not execute a commoner if they felt the commoner did not respect them duly. That was always their right before that. They took that away from them. The Last Samurai movie is about that time period when they were moving away. The Meiji emperor decided that rather than have this sort of independent military where young boys and men grew up into this, he wanted to have a modern conscription army, where everybody was trained the same, they were all equipped the same, they marched together, the sorts of things that the samurai did not do. So the samurai were kind of demoted, they were given a new title, they were called shizoku. They were no longer called samurai after this. They were called shizoku, which means warrior families. They had no privileges. It was very difficult for them because many of them did not know anything other than military life, serving a lord. And even the daimyos were demoted. They were now called kozokus, which are sort of minor nobility, but because they were wealthy families. But the samurai had to find something else to do. Some of them did join the military, and they managed to fit into this more conscription, more sort of regimented military life. Some of them ended up going into business, but many of them ended up not knowing what to do. They were all given retirement that was supposed to be paid out over time, but for economic reasons, the government offered many of them to take a one-time payout. Many accepted that, and because they knew nothing about money, they'd never been given money, they'd never been paid for anything. They spent it right away. They ended up having to pass new laws that the samurai were allowed. Legally, they had been prevented earlier, but they then were allowed to actually enter into trades. They could become weavers or potters. They could become farmers. Previously, somebody else did all the farming for them. They didn't actually work in the fields. And so there even had to be law changes in order to make that happen. Because as of the early 1870s, the samurai were no more. That's what that movie is all about, is the end of the samurai period. Yes?
Is it just the picture? That fellow doesn't even look Japanese.
Oh, he is.
Is he?
Yeah.
Just the way the picture is?
So these are both Japanese men. We had a waitress today that didn't look particularly Japanese either, I thought. But yeah,
Okay.
he is. So one of the things that happened, the samurai officially ended in the 1870s. The way of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, Bushido, technically ended at that time as well. But then in the 20th century, well, actually in the 1900s, the 20th century early on especially, Japan, as the military began to take more power in Japan and began to have ambitions to take over other areas, first Korea, then China, and then more, they began to try to reinstill this spirit of Bushido in the military. The idea that you have absolute loyalty to the emperor first, and then to those who are over you, the commanders, who were like your lords if you were in the military. So dedication to the emperor, they embedded in the military class the idea that defeat is shameful, that surrender is dishonorable. All of these have been part of the Bushido code. And even worse, perhaps, that no compassion should be expended on any defeated enemy. Men, women, or children. If they were a defeated enemy, then they should receive no compassion. And this was used to justify some of the very terrible things that the Japanese military did during the Sino-Japanese Wars and the Second World War as well. Those who surrendered were considered worthy of contempt. And this is why on Okinawa, for instance, there were 115,000 Japanese soldiers plus a lot of Okinawans that had been conscripted. 94% of them died because they would die rather than surrender. Many of them jumped off cliffs to commit suicide, or in the case, two of the commanding generals on Okinawa both committed seppuku because surrendering was considered completely unacceptable under any terms. This is also the kind of mindset that you found amongst the kamikaze pilots, to give one's life for a cause that you thought was in support of the emperor, in support of your country. So the banzai charges, the suicide charges with swords into weapons, a lot of those sorts of things you have to understand as a way that the Japanese military in the Second World War tried to reinvest the Bushido, the way of the warrior, into the military. It's often been observed by military experts that if the Imperial Japanese Army had not been so quick to do some of that, they probably would have been better off militarily. Sometimes they took action that was not very smart military because of a desire to prove their bravery, their willingness to commit suicide if necessary. And interestingly enough, in more recent times in Japan, this whole sort of almost martial mentality, this giving everything for you have a place, and to give everything in support of those who are above you, has been used by some senior managers in Japanese business to encourage this unbelievable work ethic amongst many of their workers. To work 6 or 7 days a week, long hours. You see pictures of the subways that businessmen sleep going to and from work because it's about the only time they have to really rest because they work such long hours. And some of the same kind of mindset has been used in business in more recent years. Okay, before I forget, I'm going to put that up there. Any questions about samurai or the way of Bushido? Yes?
How did you become a samurai?
How did you become a samurai? Well, first you were part of a clan. Everyone in Japan was part of a clan. And as a young man, there were, by the way, some, not many, but there were some female samurai. Not enough to make a huge difference, but there are wonderful stories about like a female samurai during the Minamoto Wars who was wearing a full mask, and she defeated another warrior in battle. She didn't kill him, but she obviously had the advantage. And when she stepped back and took off her mask and saw that it was a woman, everybody saw it was a woman. The guy immediately went and killed himself because he defeated her by a woman. Anyway, back to what you asked. How did you become a samurai? if you were in a clan and you were a young man, they were always looking for someone who could move into the samurai status. Now, it was a minor nobility. You had to be of a certain class in order to come into that. But if you showed military prowess, it was possible to move up in the ranks. You know, some of the very powerful samurai leaders had ended up fairly low down in terms of class, but still within the clans. If you were a young man and you showed the kind of courage and the kind of martial skill and other kind of characteristics, then you would be trained. It's like you would enter military school and they would be training you. I keep referring to this movie because it's got lots of bits and pieces. There are young boys in the movie The Last Samurai who are practicing, you know, with swords and with wooden swords. And so the idea was they would be watching for that, and some, as the young boys had the capability, clearly the military ability, the strength, whatever, then they would be brought up in more of a military training in order to be samurai.